All right, let's get some analysis on these US midterm elections. And for that, we'll speak to David Dunn, who joins me from Birmingham in the UK. He's a professor of international politics at the University of Birmingham. Welcome to the News Hour. Now, the Republicans were predicting very, very strong gains. What does this say about the Republican message and also their campaigning going into these midterms?
It says an awful lot about the Republican response because at a midterm you always expect a swing against the governing party, and Biden's popularity is very low. The economy is in a bad state because of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, and therefore the Republicans rightly expected a red wave. But that didn't happen. It didn't happen for two reasons. Didn't happen because the issue of abortion meant that lots of people came out and voted against the Republican Party on that particular one issue. And also, actually, it happened because Trump himself was a drag on the Republican ticket. People were concerned about his excesses, about his election denials, and about his extremism. And therefore, a lot of candidates that were endorsed by Trump, Kerry Lake in Arizona for governor, Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania, and up and down the country, didn't get the support that they may have done if they hadn't, if the Republicans had put forward a slate of candidates that were more mainstream candidates. So what we see here is a situation whereby the Republicans were underperforming as a consequence of Trump. Now, where Trump wasn't on the issue in the same way, in Florida, where Ron DeSantis, who was much more of a he's more independent of Trump, he increased his share of the vote, and the Republicans did well in Florida as a whole, despite Trump rather than because of him. So it's interesting that even among Republican voters, there is a degree of discernment as to who they will support, which candidate they support, and which ones they will not. It's interesting, of course. I mean, despite the fact that Trump calls himself the great supporter of the Republican Party, for the last elections that he's been involved with, he has actually lost the popular vote overall.
David, it's fantastic what you're saying about the star or the shadow of Trump over these elections, but I really want to move on and get your thoughts on what the implications are for foreign policy. I mean, of course, votes are still being counted for Congress, but what could this mean for foreign policy? What's at stake here? Could this affect funding for and aid for Ukraine, climate policy? What are the international implications of these midterms right now?
Absolutely. There have been several Republican candidates who've talked about there not being a blank check for Ukraine. But I think we can make too much of this. The Republican leadership in the House, Mitch McConnell, is a very firm supporter of American aid towards Ukraine. Even if it was the case that a section of those Republicans returned to office in the House were against supporting Ukraine, they would get support from the Democratic side. So I see no real pressure of any sort in terms of actually congressional funding on support for the American military aid and wider aid to Ukraine. On climate policy, similarly, there will be voices off that are representing that new intake, some of those new intake who are vocal on a whole variety of issues. But again, while the Democrats hold the White House, that is the main lever of foreign policy. So we can expect a less consensus, perhaps, a less overall consensus, but no real changes in foreign policy for the next 2 years. What happens in 2 years' time, of course, is a different matter entirely. It's more a question of what'll happen in terms of the focus internally. But of course, given that Biden is going to be blocked from passing any new legislation through the House, he may actually spend the next 2 years focusing on foreign policy initiatives, where, of course, the presidency has more authority and more agency.
David, one last thought from you. What will you be watching out for as these ballots continue to be counted?
I think the most significant consequence of this is not necessarily those returned to Washington, but actually, as your previous correspondent said, the impact on governors and secretaries of state in terms of those election denying officials who are returned for office. That the long-term implications of the most important implications of this election may be felt in 2 years' time, and as the presidential election is set up and the rules in which that is fought and the way in which those results are interpreted and counted.
David Dunn joining us there from the University of Birmingham in the UK. Thank you so much. Fantastic to hear your analysis.